We will now be looking at another issue involving the trade receivables account. Suppose a business started operations on 1st January 2014. The business sold goods on credit to the customers during year 1, and this is the first year of operation. At the end of the first year, which is on 31st December 2014, we would need to consider the impairment loss adjustment. Impairment loss adjustment is done once every year, and it is done at the end of the year using a formula. Let's people to be more familiar with this adjustment. Suppose a business has made credit sales to 4 of these customers as shown in the total trade receivables account, which is shown in the sales ledger. At the end of the year, the business has estimated that 2 of the debtors are unlikely to pay their debts. When this happens, the business would record an impairment loss by recording or by putting these 2 customers in an account called the allowance for impairment of trade receivables. The allowance for impairment of trade receivables will consist of all the blacklisted customers of the business. As mentioned, this is only an estimation by the business. Nevertheless, if anyone else were to know about whether these customers would pay up, the best people are probably the people working in the business. So the business will put both of these customers into the allowance for impairment of trade receivables account, which has a credit nature. We can see that this account has increased for the first time, and the increment is from 0 to 5,750. Now the increment in this blacklisted account is recorded in the impairment loss account. So we would need to put through the journal entry of debiting impairment loss on trade receivables and crediting the allowance for impairment of trade receivables. While these 2 accounts are very similar in nature, the impairment loss account tracks the changes in the allowance for impairment of trade receivables account. The impairment loss on the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account tells us the balance the balance of all the blacklisted customers of the business. So let's have a quick review. The allowance for impairment of trade receivables tells us the balance or the total of all the blacklisted customers at any one point in time. The changes in this allowance account is recorded in the impairment loss on trade receivables account instead. The information shown by the picture on the right hand side can also be represented in the balance sheet. The total trade receivables of 12,900 is made up of the trade receivables Chai, Ding, Ali and Ing. In the allowance for impairment of trade receivables, it comprised of all the blacklisted customers. The net trade receivables mean that the business estimates that the 2 customers Ding and Chai are able to pay their debts in the next financial period. And as mentioned previously, in our income statement, we would have the impairment loss on trade receivables account. The impairment loss on trade receivables account is the change in the balance of your allowance account. No other activities happen during the end of the first year. We will move on to the Let's look at what happened during the second year. The business, of course, would have sold more goods on credit to the customers. Some of them paid up, and then some of them went bankrupt. So watch the previous video to see how to record a customer that went bankrupt. Again, for this video, our focus is on the impairment loss adjustment, which is done once every year at the end of the year. So at the end of the second year, we would need to record the impairment loss adjustment again. So suppose that just before the impairment loss adjustment, there are 4 customers who owed the business money, one of which has been blacklisted previously. At the end of the year, the business would make a fresh estimate of who are the customers who are unable to pay their debts. Suppose in this example, the business now estimates that Ing, Chai and Gan are unlikely to pay their debts. Before this new estimate is made, we already have Ing in the blacklisted account. This means that we would need to add Chai and Gan into the blacklisted account as well. From here, I would like you to take a look at the animation, especially focus on the animation on the allowance for impairment of trade receivables account. We can see that after the new estimate, the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account has grown by $12,465. The balance in the allowance account is now $15,465. The significance of these numbers is that in my allowance for impairment of trade receivable account, we would see a balance of $15,465. However, the change in this balance, which is the $12,465, is recorded as impairment loss on trade receivables for the year. Therefore, we would need to put an increment of the impairment loss adjustment because our allowance for impairment of trade receivables account has actually increased. Form on the right hand side of the slide in the income statement and the balance sheet. As we can see, there are 4 customers that owed the business money, and the total of these customers owing is $22,665. The total blacklisted customers comprise of $15,465. This means that the business would only estimate that $7,200 of debt from FOB will be collectible within the next accounting period. In the income statement, we would see the change, which is an increment of the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account, being recorded in the impairment loss on trade receivables account. Take a look at how the balance or the amount in the allowance account is different from the impairment loss account, because both of these items measure different things. The allowance account measures the balance or the total blacklisted customer owings at a particular point in time. However, the impairment loss on trade receivable account measures the change of the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account. Suppose nothing else happened after the impairment loss adjustment, we will move on to year 3. This is the balance that was brought forward from the previous period. Moving on, we are now looking at what happened during year 3. In year 3, again, the business may have sold more goods to the customers on credit terms. Some of them may paid up, some of them may have gone bankrupt, and the business need to write them off. And let's just fast forward to the end of the year. And at the end of the year again, the business will need to do the impairment loss adjustment. Impairment loss adjustment is done once every year at the end of the year. Let's look at the scenario of what is the total of customer owings account at the end of the year before the fresh estimate of who are the new blacklisted customers. We can see that previously the business has estimated Gun to be unable to pay the debts. At the same time, Ing was written off. The interesting about Ing's story is that the business has previously estimated Ing to not be able to pay the full sum. However, Ing was able to pay $900. Ing gave the business $900 by check. This means that the business has previously made an overestimation of the debts that were uncollectible from Ing. This also means that our balance in the allowance for impairment on trade receivables account is $9,900 before the new estimate is made. At 31st December 2016, the business now estimates that Fok is the only one who is unable to pay his debts. This means that after the adjustment, we would only expect to see Fok in the allowance for impairment of trade receivables account. Let's look at the animation to show the adjustment to be made at the end of the year. We can see that now the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account has decreased. The decrease is a negative change of $2,700. Recall that before this adjustment was made, there was a balance of $9,900 in the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account, made up of Gun and the overestimation from Ing. However, after the new estimate is made, there is now a decrease of $2,700 in the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account. We will record this as a reversal on impairment loss on trade receivables account. We can also see that the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account, which has a credit balance, has now decreased, so we need to debit the allowance account, while the impairment loss account is an expense account, so to decrease it, we need to credit the expense account. Then can also be shown in our balance sheet and income statement. From here we can see that there is a total owing from 3 credit customers of $17,400. One of the customers has been blacklisted and the amount is $7,200. This means that the business only estimates that 2 of the customers, Gun and Ho, who owed $10,200, will be collectible in the future. At the same time, we would need to record the decrease or the change in the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account. This change of negative $2,700 will be recorded in the impairment loss on trade receivable account. Since this is a negative change, we would record it as a reversal on the impairment loss on trade receivables account. Again, take a look at how the allowance for impairment of trade receivable account is different from the impairment loss on trade receivable account. So if nothing else happened at the end of the 3rd year, we will move on to the 4th year with whatever balances that was brought forward. So the business now had owings from 3 customers, one of whom had been blacklisted, and the story will continue from here on. Thank you for watching the video.